Okay, hi everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a journalist and I'm based in Brussels. I was working inside the EU institutions for 7 years before joining Politico when they set themselves up in Brussels. And for the last 8 hours, I've been in charge of Politico's election campaign coverage. And so for the last 3 years, have been writing a morning column, a guide ahead to EU politics each day that's emailed to people. And I stopped that as of 8 o'clock this morning, and now I'm a political editor of Politico, and as Bridget was saying, I'm going to spend some time physically and virtually with the Institute over the next few months working up a proposal on, I guess what you would say at the very, very helicopter view is the communications challenge around the elections, and I wanted to try and bring a very, very broad perspective into a very, very narrow part of it, which is the kind of defining moments, communal moments, big moments when you can actually put a face to Europe. And I perceive debates to be that, but I'm not going to prejudge what a debate is. That's something we can chat through now. I think, sitting here as someone who has to communicate Europe, but from not within the institutions, I think the realistic starting point is to accept that most Europeans don't think of the European elections as one election, certainly, and many of them don't think about them at all. So we've all been familiar with the drop-off in the turnout rate. We've all heard the arguments about why you need to have turnout campaigns in this election. I think the level of engagement is potentially also a problem as well. And then the area where that intersects with my job at Politico and the thinking I'm trying to bring to this challenge here is the lack of a truly European public space. And that shouldn't prevent us from going out to the biggest possible audience. But I think as part of thinking through these questions that I'll present now, one of the things we have to do is find some kind of nucleus of what is a European public space. And then you can multiply things from that, and some of those things do exist, be they Eurovision, the EBU and other organizations. Some of them might have to be invented. Some of them exist for elite insiders like Politico, a lot of this is going to be a work in progress. I suspect that whatever questions I pose and whatever ones we answer over the coming months on this issue, some of it's going to be a lot more relevant in 2024 than in 2019, or a lot more actionable then, but we'll see how we go. I guess what I see my task as now with Politico is how do you imagine a European election? And that can be really at any level. Like if you think about your own national elections, or the one we can probably all commonly think about together as the United States presidential election, we don't have a lot of the triggers that anyone following that United States election might have to engage with it or understand it. So the sort of things I've been thinking about, like if you click on any website that tries to talk to you about a United States election, you will come across that map of America, which has the red and the blue states. And we don't even have those simple tools to imagine the European elections as a European election. So we've got a lot of work to do there. I think where the debates probably really connect into that challenge is putting faces on European processes. And I think that's something that I feel very familiar with in the work that I've just been doing over the last 3 years. And I think the Spitzencandidate process definitely begins that process. I think there's a serious open question about whether the Spitzencandidate process can ever really do the full job of putting a face on Europe if you don't actually put those names on a ballot paper somewhere. But it's opening up that conversation at the very least. And probably the thing that needs the most discussion, and where I don't feel I have an answer, but I have a gut instinct, is on how do you drive some of this organically. Now, I don't mean in the sense of some movement or revolution on the streets that just magically appears in our lives, but something that isn't born inside the EU institutions. The EU institutions can drive things to a certain extent. They certainly have money that probably a lot of us outside of them aren't going to have to drive things, whether it is a debate or a broader process. But for them to really, truly take off, I don't think that you can impose them just from Brussels. They have to come from somewhere else. And whatever that is, it's going to also have to marry in with the resources that let that organization be a convening power of some kind. And they're going to have to create meeting places. They're probably going to have to be digital as well as physical. Now, if I can move on. Do we press enter here? The space bar. Oh, there we go. Right.
space bars.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. So I guess the first question, if we now focus in a little bit on the debate side of things, is what is a debate in 2018? Like the thought that we are all going to have in our heads is 5 or 6 people, in the case of a European election, standing behind the lecterns. You're going to think that it's a televised debate, hopefully. It can be something that just exists in the room, but if we are trying to talk to 500 million people, talking to 500 of them in a room isn't really a useful contribution. It's going to have to be bigger than that. But I do not think that we should assume that it can be only television. I think that if you look through what are the most trusted mediums for communication, radio is really up there. Radio is a lot cheaper to organize a lot of the time as well. Radio can live on in the form of podcasts in a way that people don't necessarily return to a television event. I think that we need to seriously consider how it can happen virtually. There are media outlets like Quartz, which is a very digitally driven news outlet. They're now starting to deliver their news via things like the Messenger app with Facebook. So it kind of appears almost like you're texting with your friend, but in this case it would be 2 or 3 politicians duking it out in some kind of debate. I don't think we can eliminate those things from the thought process. And if we are going to develop some kind of like lasting structure that enables things like European-wide debates to be successful, like it's going to have to be future-proof to some extent. You're going to have to allow the possibility for the role of digital to grow and grow over time, I would say. I don't think we should assume that journalists are an essential part of the debate. Why not academics? Why not other people who can contribute to facilitating the debate? And I think if we take the lesson from the United States Presidential Debates Commission, which is probably the only one that's got any serious awareness or traction outside of its own country. This was established by the 2 main parties in 1988, and there's a 15% opinion poll threshold for participation. I don't think that threshold works in a European context, but we have to ask that question. Is there a threshold? What is the threshold? I don't think you can apply some kind of political test. I don't think it would be realistic to exclude a political party because some of us or most of us don't like where they are on the political spectrum, but maybe that support threshold is a relevant thing to apply. I think a lot of the discussions that we have had so far around how do you put a face on the election, they sometimes get stuck at that level of the Spitzenkandidat question. The more I've thought about it, and I haven't given it deep thought, but what I put into it so far, I wonder whether we're going to hit a dead end if we only focus on the Spitzenkandidat. I can imagine that you could potentially have a series of core debates or the major televised events that they just have to be around the Spitzenkandidat, otherwise that process itself is going to fall apart. But if we were to seriously get to the point of making sure every country had a debate, every language had a debate, or at least every region had a debate, it's probably going to require some other set of people to be involved in those debates. And so in that case, you may as well have it structured from the start in that way. So you don't just have ad hoc proxies or stand-ins who turn up for a debate, but you potentially have, so you can have the understudy, or you could have a pool of candidates so that each particular party has a reasonable chance of participating in a large number of debates. As I pointed out at the start, there's a lot of questions here rather than answers. You can read for yourself. There's lots of ways you can divide it up, whether it's region, country, language, and so on. The question of where those debates take place, I think that there is an existing infrastructure of organizations that have done this or want to do it. I am excited to learn from Stephen that there might be grants for others that want to be involved in that process. So I think that realistically the debates are probably the things that have to take place between March and May. I mean, you could have debates before that, but if we were to work on the presumption that there is an appetite for a year's worth of debates, I don't think we're there yet, is my input on that point. But there's obviously a series of significant events that already take place in April and May of a given year. The State of the Union conference here is one of them. There are other strategic conferences, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. There's a big program of them now that run through April and May each year. And I think it would be important to reach out to some of those organizations. You've got venues like national parliaments. We should learn from what national debates have taken place across Europe. I can't tell you that I have done that research yet, but there have been national election political debates in 87 countries, and a lot of them include, or there are a lot in Europe within that. How could you go about making sure you're maximizing the role of debates in filling that political space, in bringing that face to the election process? One model that I will try and look into more as I go around meeting the various debate commissions around the world and talking to as many people as I can in this process is the TED Talks that you're probably all familiar with. They have a model where there is the core brand, and then there's something called TEDx, where they essentially license and franchise other people who meet a certain set of standards to conduct events on their behalf. That is not without a risk. We saw in Brussels Monday, there was tension around what you're allowed to do in a TED Talk, and an artist was dragged off the stage by the local organizer for what he perceived was a breach of the standards, and then that turned into him losing his license within 24 hours. She had her top pulled off in the process, and it was unedifying. You don't need to know the details, but the point is, whilst you can use a model like that or pick another model off the shelf, it's not necessarily going to solve all of the political, cultural, organizational differences that might exist across Europe. From the discussions I have had so far with political parties, they certainly seem to want to be involved in a process like this. So if I come back to that point about it being organically outside of the EU institutions, what you probably have to do is then turn to the parties and to different media outlets to have them as potential members of any debates commission. Now, some of this is probably just pointing out the obvious to people who are already thinking about the election, but I think the value of having a structure like a debates commission is manyfold. The first is that you have either a vacuum or a mess when you think about the European elections, when you're not sitting in someone like Stephen's team in the Parliament. Because you've got a lot of people who have a very weak or shallow interest in the process, or they get to the point of approaching people like Brian and Stephen going, what can we do, what can we do? But it's not their number one priority for most of these people. It's the number one priority of some people in Brussels and not really outside. So if you don't plan ahead of time and we don't create some kind of structure for something that we might all agree to be a really important convening moment, I think you probably missed the boat on a lot of the opportunities. I think that it would be important to be as inclusive as possible. It would be really tempting just to go with what's there. You know, I would say this as someone who works for a interested but small media outlet, so you should take it with a grain of salt. But I wouldn't want a debate process to just focus on something like the European Broadcasting Union, because they're the legacy organization and they have the kind of easy reach for hitting an audience. I think we've got to think through this a little bit harder. And I think we have to try and have as many type of media as possible through as many formats as possible. And that would include organizations, for example, like Netflix or YouTube. You know, if we're trying to reach the biggest audience possible, or the target audience for driving participation in the election is going to young people who vote at a lower rate, or the weak abstainers, then we've got to be open to whichever formats, channels, distribution companies might be able to get us there. I think there's probably not so many global lessons available so far. The US is the one that has the biggest set of data and the most examples that we can refer to. And they have certainly, well, any study that exists around the US presidential debates will say there's a value to that organization existing and that it facilitates voters understanding the election. And Canada will probably be the most new and fresh example. It's currently going through the Parliament now, establishing their debates commission. And I hope that I'll be able to chat with some of those people in person in June. Now, probably I should stop talking, but I will be very happy to answer any questions at the end.
Thank you.